After having studied the sampling approach in some detail, I just want to quickly review in the next few slides the observational approach and the sampling approach and how these two can be combined into what I'm calling a hybrid approach. So first, in the observational approach, we recall that a key feature is that the exposure monitoring data are not needed at the beginning. It's a subjective exercise that relies on professional judgment, and it is likely that two different industrial hygienists may arrive at different SEG classifications. If the value of the R95 is less than 2, then the variability in exposure is primarily due to within-worker variability and driven by process, job, task, and control variables. However, if individual workers have exposures that are significantly different, that is, the value of the R95 is greater than 2, which corresponds to a between-worker GST of greater than 1.2, then differences in individual work practices in performing the jobs and tasks are driving exposure variability. In other words, the between-worker variability is driving overall exposure variability. The characteristics used to establish SEGs by the observational approach are only marginally related to between-worker components of variability. Thus, workers in two different SEGs may have overlapping exposure distributions, and this could potentially lead to misclassification of exposures. In contrast, in the sampling approach, the entire population of workers is randomly sampled and only then divided into monomorphic groups, or what we refer to as SEGs. And this requires multiple measurements of every sample worker in an SEG in order to estimate both between and within worker components of variance. The two approaches, the observational and the sampling approaches, can be combined into a hybrid approach because the observational approach is efficient, as we discovered. It requires very few number of measurements. However, it can be ineffective in that it does not necessarily classify workers into correct groups. However, the risks of such potential misclassification vary from one SEG to the next. And the industrial hygienist should be able to identify the SEGs for which the potential for misclassification is significant. The workers in these SEGs that are referred to as critical SEGs would be monitored more thoroughly for obtaining estimates of within and between worker variability. And so you can see how this approach would be more efficient than either the observational approach or the sampling approach. The observational approach may not necessarily classify workers into correct groups, but it's very efficient. The sampling approach is going to be very effective in that it'll classify workers into correct groups, but it is very inefficient, meaning it requires a large number of measurements. But using good professional judgment, we can split the difference and focus our resources on the SEGs where we do need a lot of measurements. And for the other cases where we don't need a lot of measurements, we can use the observational approach. SEGs with profiles above the OEL would not be sampled, as resources would be better spent in controlling those exposures. Similarly, SEGs with exposures below 10% of the OEL could also be excluded from sampling. And sampling is recommended for all SEGs that have exposure profiles above 10% of the OEL. For SEGs that have exposure profiles even closer to the OEL, for example, between 50 to 100% of the OEL, multiple measurements for each sample worker might be needed.